Hollywood has built an entire industry around the romance of medieval castle life. Stone towers catching the morning light, candlelit banquets overflowing with roast game, noble women drifting through corridors in flowing silk, and armored knights jousting for honor beneath bright pennants. It is a gorgeous fantasy, and it has almost nothing to do with what actually happened inside those walls. The real medieval castle was dark, freezing, choked with smoke, and reeking of things no modern nose could tolerate for 5 minutes. The floors harbored their own ecosystems, the toilets emptied into the moat, and the medical care would make a modern veterinarian uncomfortable. Today, we are looking at what daily life inside a medieval castle actually smelled, tasted, and felt like. Fair warning, you may want to set down whatever you're eating. One of the first things a visitor to a medieval castle would have noticed was the floor. Throughout England and much of northern Europe, stone castle floors from roughly the 11th century onward were covered with rushes, dried marsh grasses spread across the surface to provide insulation against the cold and muffle the echo of boots on bare rock. The idea was simple. Servants would sweep the old rushes out and lay fresh ones on a regular schedule. The reality in most households was quite different. Erasmus, writing about his experiences in England in the early 16th century, described the typical English floor covering as a collection of rushes that had been layered over for 20 years without removal, harboring beneath them remnants of fish, spittle, vomit, and the leakage of dogs. He was not describing a particularly neglected home. He was describing the standard. Fresh rushes went down on top. Old rushes stayed underneath. The bottom layers decomposed into a packed, damp mat, teeming with insect larvae, and soaked through with everything that had been spilled, dropped, or excreted onto it over months and years. Household manuals from the 13th and 14th centuries recommended scattering lavender, meadowsweet, or tansy across the surface to combat the smell. This is roughly equivalent to spraying perfume inside a sewer. It addresses the top note. It does nothing about the foundation. A full strip and replacement happened perhaps 2 or 3 times per year, typically timed to a major feast or the arrival of a guest whose opinion mattered. For the months in between, the entire household ate, walked, and dropped food scraps onto what was functionally an indoor compost heap with a thin herbal garnish. The castle toilet was called a garderobe, a word that literally meant wardrobe. The connection was not accidental. People stored clothing near the latrine shaft because the ammonia rising from the waist below was believed to kill moths and lice feeding on fabric. Whether this actually worked is debatable. That people thought hanging their good tunics next to a chute full of sewage was a sound pest control strategy tells you everything about the baseline hygiene expectations of the period. The garderobe itself was a small stone closet built into the thickness of the castle wall, usually with a round opening cut through a wooden or stone bench. Beneath the seat, a vertical shaft dropped straight down the exterior of the wall, emptying into the castle moat into a cesspit dug at the base, or in some particularly direct arrangements, onto the rocks below with no collection at all. There was no flush mechanism, no trap, and no ventilation worth the name. The accumulated waste sat in heaps that could grow enormous over time, until a worker called a gong farmer was hired to climb in and shovel it out by hand. Gong farmers worked at night for reasons of social decency and the preference of castle residents not to witness the process. They were among the lowest paid laborers in medieval England, and given that the job involved wading waist-deep through months of human waste in the dark, there is a strong argument they were the most underpaid people in European history. The garderobe shaft also created a military vulnerability. During the siege of Château Gaillard in Normandy in 1204, French soldiers reportedly climbed up through the chapel garderobe chute to breach the fortifications from below. They hauled themselves through accumulated human waste to get inside the castle. Whatever the defenders expected that morning, it was probably not an armed soldier emerging from the latrine covered in filth. Beyond siege warfare, the garderobe was simply dangerous to use after dark. No handrails, no lighting, a slippery bench, and a shaft dropping several stories. Using the toilet at midnight in a medieval castle required a certain amount of courage. Before wall-mounted fireplaces with proper chimneys became widespread in the 13th and 14th centuries, most castle halls were heated by a central open hearth, a fire built directly on the floor in the middle of the room. The smoke was meant to rise and escape through a hole in the roof called a louver. In practice, it went everywhere. It filled the hall, blackened the walls, stung the eyes, and settled into the lungs of everyone present. Chronic respiratory problems were a routine part of castle life. William Harrison, an English clergyman writing in 1577, reflected on the recent spread of chimneys as one of the great improvements of his age and expressed genuine amazement that earlier generations had tolerated the smoke-filled interiors. He noted that the old arrangement left occupants seated directly in the path of the smoke, which did not seldom sear their heads. The transition to chimney-equipped fireplaces happened slowly and unevenly across Europe, leaving many castles reliant on the central hearth deep into the late medieval period. Lighting was equally bleak. Beeswax candles were expensive imports reserved for the chapel and the lord's private quarters. Everyone else used tallow candles, rendered from animal fat, which produced a weak, sputtering flame that smelled like burnt grease. A handful of these, plus the hearth fire, constituted the entire lighting supply for a hall housing dozens of people. When the sun dropped early on a midwinter afternoon in northern France or England, the castle did not become cozy. It became dark, cold, and filled with a haze of wood smoke and the odor of rendered mutton fat. That was the medieval version of a warm evening at home. The castle kitchen was frequently housed in a separate building, and for good reason. Open flame cooking over massive hearths, combined with wooden utensils and grease-soaked surfaces, made kitchen fires one of the leading causes of structural damage in medieval fortifications. The cook worked in conditions that would shut down a modern restaurant in minutes. Meat turned on spits over open flames, attended by kitchen boys who stood close enough to the fire that burns were a routine occupational hazard. In some larger English households, dogs were placed inside wooden tread wheels connected to the spit mechanism and made to run to keep the meat rotating, a practice that survived in certain kitchens well into the 17th century. The real challenge with castle food was not cooking, but keeping it from going off. Without refrigeration, meat and fish had to be salted, smoked, or pickled to last more than a few days. Salted meat was a staple from autumn through spring, preserved so heavily that it required soaking in fresh water for hours before it could be chewed. Even after soaking, the result was tough, brutally salty, and nutritionally questionable after months sitting in a barrel. Fresh meat was available primarily during the autumn slaughter season, when livestock was killed in large numbers because most lords could not afford to feed their animals through the winter. Everything that could be preserved was preserved. Everything that could not was eaten immediately or thrown to the dogs. Grain brought its own dangers. Castle granaries were far from airtight, leaving stored rye, wheat, and barley exposed to moisture, rodent contamination, and a fungal infection called ergot. Ergot infects rye and produces toxic alkaloids that, when consumed in bread, cause a condition historically known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms are genuinely nightmarish: convulsions, vivid hallucinations, a burning sensation in the limbs, gangrene of the fingers and toes, and in severe cases, death. A devastating outbreak in France in 994 killed thousands of people. The contaminated grain showed only a slight purplish discoloration on the rye kernel, and in an era with no food safety inspections, it was ground into flour and baked along with everything else. Bread quality depended entirely on where you sat at the table. The lord and his family ate manchet, a fine white loaf made from carefully sifted wheat flour. Servants and laborers ate maslin, a coarser bread mixed with rye and stretched with ground peas, barley meal, or whatever filler was on hand. Stale bread served a second life as tableware. Trenchers, thick slices of day-old loaf, were placed in front of diners to hold the meat and soak up the juices. After the meal, the grease-soaked trencher was eaten by the servants, fed to the dogs, or collected in baskets and handed to the poor gathered outside the castle gate. Whether this counted as charity or waste disposal has been a matter of academic debate for centuries. Spices, often cited in popular history as a method for disguising the taste of spoiled meat, were in reality far too expensive for that purpose. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were luxury imports from Asia, traded through Venice and Constantinople at prices that made them weight for weight more valuable than the meat they supposedly rescued. A household rich enough to afford saffron was not eating spoiled beef. It was showing off. The people eating questionable meat could not afford saffron in the first place. The water supply inside a medieval castle came from one of two sources: a well dug within the walls or a cistern collecting rainwater. Neither was reliably clean. Wells were often positioned in the courtyard near the stables, the cesspit, and the garderobe drainage, which meant groundwater contamination was less a risk than a guarantee. Cistern water sat in stone tanks open to bird droppings, dust, algae, and whatever small creature fell in and drowned. Nobody understood waterborne disease in the modern sense, but people noticed that drinking the water sometimes made you sick. The practical solution was not filtration or boiling. It was avoidance. Ale was the default daily beverage in medieval England, consumed at breakfast, dinner, and supper by men, women, and children alike. This was not the strong hopped beer that came later. It was small ale, a weak, lightly sour brew made by running water through already used grain mash, producing a drink with just enough alcohol to inhibit bacterial growth without leaving the household incapacitated by noon. Brewing was primarily the work of women known as alewives, and a castle of any real size maintained a dedicated brewhouse running more or less continuously. A single large household could go through hundreds of gallons in a week. For the lord and his guests, imported French wine was the preferred drink, sometimes heated and sweetened with honey and spices into a warm concoction called hippocras. Even the wine came with a hidden cost. It was commonly stored and served in vessels containing lead, which leached steadily into the liquid over time. Chronic lead poisoning among the medieval aristocracy is well documented through modern analysis of skeletal remains, and it may account for some of the erratic behavior attributed to various nobles and monarchs across the period. The peasants drinking weak ale from wooden cups may have quietly had the safer arrangement all along. Contrary to the popular claim that medieval people never washed at all, the truth is more nuanced and only slightly less revolting. Bathing did happen, it just happened rarely, required significant logistical effort, and was not universally encouraged. The medieval Catholic Church sent conflicting signals on the subject. Cleanliness was broadly acknowledged as a virtue, but excessive attention to the body was associated with vanity, and, more dangerously, with the public bathhouses across Europe that had earned a solid reputation as fronts for prostitution. The bathhouses of Southwark in London, known as the Stews, operated under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, a fact that says something about the complicated relationship between organized religion and personal hygiene during this period. For castle residents, a full bath was an event requiring planning and labor. Water had to be drawn from the well, heated over the kitchen fire in large kettles, and carried by servants in buckets to a wooden tub set up in the lord's private chamber or near the main hearth. The process could take hours. The same water was reused by multiple bathers in descending order of social rank: the lord first, then his wife, then the children, then the servants, each inheriting whatever the previous bather had contributed to the water. Between full baths, people cleaned their hands and face with a basin and ewer, particularly before meals. John Russell's Book of Nurture, written around 1460, provides careful instructions for how a servant should present the washing basin to a lord before dining, specifying the correct water temperature and the proper way to hold the towel. Hand washing before eating was taken seriously, though the concern was courtesy and visible respectability rather than anything resembling germ theory. Hair was washed less frequently. Lice treatment was considered a separate undertaking and involved fine-toothed combs, herbal rinses made from vinegar and various plant extracts, and in persistent cases, shaving the head entirely. The medieval approach to personal cleanliness was not outright neglect. It was triage. You cleaned what you could, when you could, with the tools available, and the tools were limited. No honest account of medieval castle life can avoid the other permanent residents: the rats, the fleas, the lice, and the full supporting cast of creatures that crawled, hopped, and burrowed through every corner of the household. Vermin were not an occasional inconvenience in a medieval castle. They were a fixed feature of daily existence, as embedded in the place as the stonework. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was the dominant rodent in medieval Europe and found castle environments ideal. Grain stores provided a steady food source. Rush-covered floors offered shelter and nesting material. Thick stone walls were riddled with gaps and crevices where colonies could establish themselves and multiply unchecked. Rats contaminated food supplies, fouled water sources, and gnawed through anything organic they could reach, including leather goods, tallow candles, and on occasion, the extremities of sleeping humans. Their fleas, carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis, would eventually be identified as the primary transmission vector for the bubonic plague, though the people living alongside them had no idea they were sharing their home with the delivery mechanism for the deadliest pandemic in European history. Fleas and lice were universal afflictions that infested bedding, clothing, hair, and every surface in regular contact with human skin. The English word lousy, meaning worthless or contemptible, comes directly from the word louse, and the fact that a parasitic insect gave rise to a common term of everyday contempt tells you how deeply familiar the experience of infestation was to the general population. Delousing was a regular communal activity, particularly among women, who picked nits and adult lice from each other's hair in a practice that served both hygiene and social bonding. Fine-toothed bone and ivory combs designed specifically for lice removal have been recovered from archaeological sites across England, France, and the Low Countries, and they show the kind of heavy wear that comes from daily use sustained over years. Remedies for infestation ranged from useless to actively poisonous. Mercury-based ointments were rubbed into the scalp and skin to kill lice, a treatment that sometimes succeeded in destroying the parasites and also slowly poisoned the person using it. Sulfur was burned in enclosed rooms to drive out fleas, filling the space with choking fumes. Bundles of fleabane and pennyroyal were stuffed into mattresses as repellents with inconsistent results. Some castle owners kept cats as working pest controllers, and household accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries occasionally note payments for the feeding and upkeep of castle cats, one of the few medieval domestic arrangements that a modern person might look at and think, yes, that makes sense. The fundamental problem was architectural. A medieval castle was a porous structure full of cracks, straw, and organic waste. From a rat or a flea's perspective, it was purpose-built accommodation. Every campaign to clear them out was temporary because the conditions that attracted vermin never changed. Falling ill or sustaining an injury inside a medieval castle placed you at the mercy of a medical system where the treatment was frequently more alarming than the condition it claimed to address. Medical understanding across Europe was governed by the theory of the four humors, a framework inherited from Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century. The human body, according to this model, was regulated by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness resulted from an imbalance among them. The logical treatment within this framework was to drain whatever was in excess, which is how bloodletting became the single most commonly prescribed medical procedure in medieval Europe. Bloodletting was performed by barber surgeons using a small bladed instrument called a phleem, designed to open a vein in the arm, or by pressing live leeches directly against the skin and allowing them to feed until they dropped off engorged. The procedure was recommended for fevers, headaches, infections, persistent sadness, and even as preventive maintenance for people who felt perfectly well. Monasteries across Europe scheduled regular group bloodletting sessions for their monks, treating it as routine upkeep for the body, much the way one might service a piece of equipment. For battlefield wounds and serious injuries, the options were bleak. Open cuts were cauterized with heated iron rods to stop the bleeding and seal the wound, performed without anesthesia beyond whatever alcohol happened to be available. Deep wounds were routinely treated with boiling oil poured directly into the opening, a standard practice that persisted until the French military surgeon Ambroise Paré, working in the 16th century, ran out of oil during a campaign and was forced to dress some soldiers' wounds with a simple mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine instead. To his considerable surprise, the soldiers treated without the boiling oil recovered faster, with less swelling and far less pain than those who had received the standard scalding. He had stumbled onto one of the most important breakthroughs in wound care purely by accident, because he ran out of the thing that had been making everything worse. Trepanning, the practice of boring or scraping a hole through the skull, was performed for chronic headaches, seizures, and head injuries. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across medieval Europe reveals skulls with neatly drilled openings surrounded by new bone growth, which means the patient survived the operation and lived for years afterward. Whether they experienced any relief from their original complaint is far less certain. For everyday ailments, uroscopy was the primary diagnostic method. The physician would hold a glass flask of the patient's urine up to the light and assess its color, clarity, smell, and sometimes taste against a reference chart called a urine wheel. Diagnosis by urine was considered a sophisticated medical art, and physicians who specialized in it charged premium fees for the privilege of examining your bodily fluids and pronouncing a verdict. Herbal remedies filled in the gaps. Willow bark for pain, which contained a natural precursor to what we now call aspirin, alongside less effective prescriptions such as powdered pearls for heart complaints or crushed beetles for urinary problems. The medieval medicine cabinet was an unpredictable mix of things that accidentally worked and things that absolutely did not, dispensed with equal confidence and at comparable cost. Dental health inside a medieval castle ranged from neglected to genuinely harrowing. Toothbrushes as we know them did not exist. Teeth were cleaned, when they were cleaned at all, by rubbing them with a coarse linen cloth dipped in salt or a gritty paste made from crushed sage, charcoal, and sometimes ground cuttlefish bone. Frayed twigs called chew sticks served as a rough alternative in some parts of Europe, and while they were marginally better than nothing, they were not meaningfully altering anyone's dental trajectory. The condition of medieval teeth varied by social class, and not in the direction most people would guess. Peasants and laborers, whose diet consisted mainly of coarse bread, root vegetables, and tough meat, tended to have stronger teeth than the aristocracy. The wealthy had access to imported sugar, arriving through trade routes from the Middle East and later from Mediterranean plantations, and they consumed it with enthusiasm. Sugar attacked medieval enamel with the same efficiency it manages today, and dental remains recovered from high-status burial sites consistently show more cavities, more abscesses, and more missing teeth than the graves of people from lower social standings. When a tooth became too painful to ignore, the barber surgeon stepped in. Extraction was performed using a pelican, a heavy metal lever that gripped the crown of the tooth and wrenched it out with brute force. There was no anesthesia. There was no follow-up care. The patient gripped whatever was available and endured it. The prevailing explanation for tooth decay was the toothworm, a tiny creature believed to bore into the enamel and gnaw at the tooth from within. Some treatments involved holding a candle flame near the affected tooth in an effort to coax the worm out. The single genuinely useful remedy in the medieval dental toolkit was oil of cloves, which contains eugenol, a compound with real analgesic and mild antiseptic properties. It numbed the pain and slowed infection. It is still used in dental practice today, making it one of the very few medieval treatments that survived contact with actual science. For a woman inside a medieval castle, giving birth was among the most dangerous events she would face, and she was likely to face it many times. A noblewoman might bear 8 to 12 children across her lifetime, and each delivery carried well-documented risk. The birthing chamber was a sealed room, heavy curtains drawn across the windows and doors to block drafts, which also effectively shut out fresh air and natural light. Midwives attended the delivery, and their competence varied enormously. Medical texts of the period offered guidance that ranged from sensible positioning advice to recommendations involving eagle stones tied to the thigh and prayers recited to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of women in labor. The physical dangers were severe and straightforward. Obstructed labor, hemorrhage, and infection after delivery killed mothers with a regularity that would constitute a public health emergency by any modern standard. Among English noble families, whose records survive in greater detail than most, The maternal death rate is estimated at roughly 1 to 2% per delivery, a number that sounds modest until you consider that a woman might deliver a dozen times across her childbearing years. The cumulative risk was anything but trivial. Infant mortality was worse. Across medieval Europe, roughly 1 child in 3 did not survive to the age of 5. Disease, contaminated water, malnutrition, and the general harshness of the environment took them in numbers that are difficult to comprehend from a modern vantage point. Baptism was performed as quickly as possible after birth, sometimes within hours, because the theological urgency of securing an infant's soul against the possibility of early death was taken with absolute seriousness. Midwives were authorized by the church to perform emergency baptisms if no priest could arrive in time. The commonly repeated claim that medieval life expectancy was only 30 or 35 years is technically accurate but deeply misleading. That figure is an average dragged down by the catastrophic rates of infant and child mortality. A person who survived childhood and managed to avoid plague, battlefield injury, and the local barber surgeon had a reasonable chance of reaching their 50s or 60s. But surviving the first 5 years was the hard part, and inside a medieval castle surrounded by contaminated water, vermin-infested straw, and physicians whose primary diagnostic instrument was a flask of urine held up to the light, the odds were stacked against you from the moment you arrived. So the next time you find yourself watching a period drama and wishing you could step through the screen into a grand medieval castle, take a moment to remember the floors, the garderobe, the rats, and the barber surgeon standing by with his phlegm and a confident smile. The past is endlessly fascinating. It is also, for the most part, deeply unpleasant to inhabit. If you enjoyed this trip through medieval filth, leave a comment telling us which part made you the most grateful for indoor plumbing, and subscribe so you do not miss the next journey into the grimier corners of history.